Alexander stood at the tall window of Thornfield Castle, watching the rain hit the glass. His hands were shaking a little, but he tried to hide it. Behind him, his wife Charlotte sat on the old leather chair, her fingers playing with her wedding ring. She had been doing that a lot lately when she was worried. The letter had come that morning, the one they had been waiting for, but also the one they feared most. It sat on the dark wooden table between them, still unopened. The royal seal was broken, but neither of them had read what was inside yet. Charlotte looked up at her husband. His tall frame was tense, and she could see the worry in his shoulders. They had been married for 8 years now, and she knew all his signs. When Alexander was scared, he became very quiet and stood very still. "We have to read it sometime," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but inside her heart was beating fast. Alexander turned around slowly. His blue eyes met her brown ones, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They both knew what this letter could mean. It could change everything about their quiet life in the countryside. "I know," he said, walking over to the table. He picked up the letter with careful hands, as if it might break. "But once we read it, there's no going back." Charlotte stood up and moved to stand beside him. She was smaller than him, but she was strong. Everyone who knew her said she had a brave heart. "We'll face whatever it says together," she told him, "just like we always do." The castle around them was quiet. Their 3 children were upstairs with their teacher, learning about history and mathematics. Young Emma was only 6, but she was already asking questions about why Papa looked so worried. Lately, Thomas, who was 9, had noticed too. He kept trying to make jokes to cheer up his parents. And little James, just 4 years old, still played happily, not understanding that something big was happening. Alexander opened the letter slowly. His eyes moved across the words, and Charlotte watched his face change. First, he looked surprised, then worried, then something else she couldn't quite understand. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He handed her the letter without speaking. Charlotte read it quickly, then read it again more slowly. Her face went pale and she sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The letter was from the royal council. Alexander's older brother, Prince David, had fallen very ill. The doctors said he might not get better. If something happened to David, Alexander would become the next heir to the throne. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The letter also said that there were rumors, bad rumors about their family. Someone had been spreading stories that weren't true, trying to make people think terrible things about Alexander and Charlotte. The council wanted them to come to the capital city right away to answer questions and clear their names. "This is madness," Charlotte said, her hands trembling as she held the letter. "Who would say such things about us? We've lived quietly here. For years, we don't bother anyone." Alexander sat down across from her. He ran his hands through his dark hair, something he did when he was trying to think. "I have ideas about who might be behind this," he said quietly. "But I hoped I was wrong." "Who?" Charlotte asked, though she had a feeling she already knew. "My cousin Richard," Alexander said. "He's always believed he should be next in line instead of David or me. If he can make people doubt us, maybe he thinks he can take our place." Charlotte felt angry and scared at the same time. Richard had never liked her. He thought Alexander had married beneath his station because she wasn't born into royalty. She had grown up as the daughter of a respected doctor, not a princess. Richard had made it clear many times that he didn't think she belonged in the royal family. "What do we do?" she asked. Alexander reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were warm and strong, and they made her feel a little better. "We have to go to the capital," he said. "We have to face this. If we stay here and hide, people will think the rumors are true." Charlotte nodded, but her stomach felt sick with worry. "What about the children? Should we take them with us?" "I think they'll be safer here," Alexander said. "Your sister Margaret can stay with them. She's good with children, and the staff here will protect them." They sat in silence for a few minutes, both thinking about what this meant. Their peaceful life was about to change completely. Charlotte thought about the capital city with its crowds and noise and people watching everything they did. She thought about the newspapers that would write stories about them, whether those stories were true or not. "I'm scared," she admitted, quietly. Alexander squeezed her hands. "So am I," he said. "But we'll get through this. We have to. Our children need us to be strong." That evening they called Margaret and asked her to come to the castle right away. When she arrived, they explained what was happening. Margaret was Charlotte's younger sister, and she had always been practical and brave. "Of course I'll stay with the children," Margaret said without hesitation. "You two need to go and fight these lies. I'll keep Emma, Thomas, and James safe and happy until you come back." Later that night, after they had told the children that Mama and Papa had to go on an important trip, Alexander and Charlotte packed their bags. They didn't know how long they would be gone or what they would face when they arrived in the capital. As Charlotte folded her dresses, she thought about all the things that could go wrong. What if people believed the rumors? What if they couldn't prove their innocence? What if Alexander's brother died and they had to become the next king and queen while everyone doubted them? Alexander came up behind her and put his arms around her waist. "Whatever happens," he said, "we'll face it together. That's what we promised each other on our wedding day. Remember?" Charlotte leaned back against him and closed her eyes. She did remember. They had promised to stand by each other through good times and bad times, through easy days and hard days. Tomorrow would definitely be a hard day, but they would face it together. Outside, the rain had stopped, but storm clouds were still gathering in the distance. Charlotte couldn't help but think that the real storm was just beginning. The journey to the capital city took 2 days by carriage. Alexander and Charlotte sat mostly in silence, watching the countryside change from green hills to busy towns filled with people. Charlotte noticed how people stared at their royal carriage as it passed through the villages. Some waved, but others just watched with curious eyes. On the second morning, Charlotte woke up feeling sick to her stomach. She had barely slept in the uncomfortable in bed, and her mind kept thinking about what waited for them in the capital. Alexander was already awake, standing by the small window and looking out at the gray sky. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked him quietly. He turned around and gave her a tired smile. "A little, not much," she admitted. She got up and walked over to him. Outside, she could see the tall buildings of the capital city in the distance. Smoke was rising from hundreds of chimneys, and even from here they could hear the noise of the busy streets. "It looks different than I remembered," Alexander said. "Bigger, noisier." Charlotte had only been to the capital city once before, right after she and Alexander got married. Back then it had seemed exciting and full of possibilities. Now it felt scary and dangerous. They ate a quick breakfast and got back in their carriage for the final part of their journey. As they got closer to the city center, the streets became more crowded. People were everywhere, walking quickly, carrying baskets, talking loudly to each other. Then Charlotte saw something that made her heart sink. On the corner of a busy street, a man was selling newspapers. She could see the headlines from the carriage window, and her name was written there in big black letters. She couldn't read all the words, but she could see enough to know it wasn't good news. "Alexander," she said, pointing to the newspaper stand. He looked where she was pointing and his face became very serious. "Don't read them," he told her. "Whatever they're saying, it's not true. We know the truth, and that's what matters." But Charlotte felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. All these people, all these strangers, were reading lies about her and her family. She wondered what her children would think if they saw these newspapers. She was glad they were safe at home with Margaret. The royal palace was even more impressive than Charlotte remembered. The tall gates were made of gold and iron, and guards in red uniforms stood at attention as their carriage approached. The palace itself was huge, with hundreds of windows and towers that seemed to reach up to the clouds. A man in a fancy uniform came to meet them as they got out of the carriage. Charlotte recognized him as Lord Hampton, one of the king's most trusted advisors. He had a kind face, but today he looked worried. "Your Highness, Lady Charlotte," he said, bowing slightly. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm afraid the situation has become quite complicated." "How complicated?" Alexander asked as they walked toward the palace entrance. Lord Hampton glanced around nervously. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. There are ears everywhere in the city these days." They followed him through the grand entrance hall. Charlotte tried not to stare at the beautiful paintings on the walls and the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Everything was so different from their simple life at Thornfield Castle. Lord Hampton led them to a small room that was much more comfortable than the fancy public rooms. There were soft chairs and a warm fire burning in the fireplace. But Charlotte noticed that the windows were covered with thick curtains, and the door was closed tightly behind them. "Please sit," Lord Hampton said. "I need to tell you everything that's been happening while you were traveling here." Alexander and Charlotte sat close together on a small sofa. Charlotte reached for Alexander's hand, and he squeezed her fingers gently. "The rumors have gotten worse," Lord Hampton began. "Someone has been very busy spreading stories about you both. They're saying that Alexander isn't really the king's nephew. They're saying that Charlotte married him only for money and power. They're even saying that your children aren't really yours." Charlotte felt like someone had hit her in the stomach. "That's impossible," she said, her voice shaking. "Everyone knows our children. They look just like Alexander." "I know that," Lord Hampton said kindly, "but the person spreading these lies is very clever. They have papers that look official. They have witnesses who are willing to tell false stories. They even have a man who claims to be Alexander's real father." Alexander stood up quickly, his face red with anger. "This is madness. Who would go to such trouble to destroy us?" Lord Hampton looked uncomfortable. "We believe it's your cousin Richard, but we can't prove it yet. He's been very careful to hide his involvement." Charlotte felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. She had to be strong. "What can we do?" she asked. "The king wants to see you both tomorrow morning," Lord Hampton said. "He's very sick, as you know, but he's still thinking clearly. He doesn't believe these rumors, but he needs you to help him understand what's really happening." "And Prince David?" Alexander asked. "How is my brother?" Lord Hampton's face became even more serious. "I'm afraid he's gotten worse. The doctors aren't sure he'll recover. That's why these rumors are so dangerous. If something happens to David, and people believe these lies about you, Richard could claim the throne." That night, Charlotte and Alexander stayed in rooms at the palace. Charlotte's room was beautiful, with silk curtains and a bed that was bigger than any she had ever seen. but she couldn't enjoy any of it. She kept thinking about her children at home and wondering if they were safe. There was a soft knock on her door. Alexander came in looking as worried as she felt. "I can't sleep either," he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I keep thinking about Emma and Thomas and James," Charlotte said. "What if Richard tries to hurt them?" "Margaret will protect them," Alexander said. "And our guards at the castle are good men. The children are safer there than they would be." Here Charlotte nodded, but she still felt scared. What if the king doesn't believe us tomorrow? What if he thinks the rumors are true? Alexander was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll have to find another way to prove our innocence. We can't give up, Charlotte. Too many people are depending on us." "I never wanted to be a princess," Charlotte said quietly. "I was happy just being your wife and the mother of our children." "I know," Alexander said, taking her hand. "But sometimes life chooses our path for us. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to it." The next morning came too quickly. Charlotte put on her best dress, a dark blue one that Alexander had given her for their anniversary. She looked at herself in the mirror and tried to see what other people saw when they looked at her. Did she look like someone who would marry for money? Did she look like someone who would lie and cheat? She didn't think so, but she knew that people often saw what they wanted to see, not what was really there. Alexander knocked on her door. He was wearing his formal court clothes, and he looked every inch the prince he was born to be. But Charlotte could see the worry in his eyes. "Are you ready?" he asked. Charlotte took a deep breath. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked together through the long hallways of the palace, toward the throne room where the king was waiting for them. With each step, Charlotte felt more nervous, but also more determined. Whatever happened in that room, she would face it with dignity and truth. The throne room was the largest room Charlotte had ever seen in her life. The ceiling was so high she had to crane her neck to see the painted angels floating among golden clouds. Tall pillars made of white marble stood like ancient trees throughout the room, and the floor was covered in patterns made from precious stones that sparkled under the light of 100 candles. But Charlotte barely noticed the beauty around her. All her attention was focused on the man sitting on the golden throne. At the far end of the room, King Edward looked much older and thinner than the last time she had seen him. His one strong frame seemed small against the massive throne, and his face was pale and drawn with illness. Alexander walked beside her, his steps echoing in the vast space. Charlotte could feel dozens of eyes watching them as they made their way across the room. Nobles and court officials lined the walls, all dressed in their finest clothes, all whispering quietly among themselves when they reached the throne. Both Alexander and Charlotte bowed deeply. The king gestured for them to rise, and Charlotte was relieved to see that his eyes were still sharp and intelligent, even though his body was clearly weak. "Your Majesty," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "we came as quickly as we could." King Edward studied them both for a long moment before speaking. His voice was not as strong as it once was, but it still carried the authority of someone who had ruled for 30 years. "My dear nephew," he said, looking directly at Alexander, "these are dark times for our family." "Dark times indeed." Charlotte felt her heart beating so fast she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. She kept her eyes focused on the king, trying not to look at the faces around them that were watching every move they made. "I have heard many disturbing stories these past few weeks," the king continued. "Stories that question your very identity, Alexander. Stories that suggest your marriage was built on deception. Stories that cast doubt on the legitimacy of your children." The words hit Charlotte like physical blows. She felt her cheeks burn with shame, not because the accusations were true, but because they were being spoken aloud in front of all these important people. Alexander stepped forward slightly. "Your Majesty, every word of these stories is false. I am your brother's son, as I have always been. My wife is a woman of honor who married me for love, not position. Our children are our own flesh and blood." The king nodded slowly. "I believe you, nephew. But belief is not enough in these times. We need proof. We need evidence that will silence these rumors once and for all." A man Charlotte did not recognize stepped out from the crowd of nobles. He was tall and thin, with cold gray eyes and a calculating expression. She instinctively disliked him. "Your Majesty," the man said, bowing low, "if I may present the evidence we have gathered." Charlotte watched in horror as the man produced a leather folder filled with papers. He opened it and began to read from documents that looked official and important. "This birth certificate shows that Prince Alexander was not born in the royal palace as claimed, but in a common inn 50 miles away. This witness statement from a midwife claims that the real prince died at birth, and Alexander is actually the son of traveling performers who sold their child to the royal family." Charlotte felt the room spinning around her. The lies were so detailed, so carefully constructed, that for a moment she wondered if other people might actually believe them. Alexander's voice was steady when he spoke, but Charlotte could hear the anger underneath. "And who provided you with these documents?" "Lord Blackwood." So this was Lord Blackwood, Charlotte thought. She had heard Alexander mention him before, always with distrust. He was known to be ambitious and ruthless, willing to do anything to gain more power. Lord Blackwood. It smiled, but it was not a pleasant smile. "The documents came from various sources, Your Highness," people who felt it was their duty to reveal the truth. What truth? Alexander demanded. These papers are forgeries. This witness is lying. Where is your proof that any of this is real? Before Lord Blackwood could answer, another voice spoke from the crowd. It was a woman Charlotte recognized with a shock of surprise and fear. Lady Victoria, Richard's mother and Alexander's aunt. Perhaps the proof is in the questions themselves. Lady Victoria said, her voice sweet but poisonous. Why would anyone go to such trouble to create false documents unless they were trying to hide something real? Charlotte felt tears of frustration starting to form, but she forced them back. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Your Majesty, she said, surprising herself with how strong her voice sounded. I have been married to your nephew for 8 years. I have watched him with our children, seen him care for his people, observed his devotion to this family and this kingdom. No amount of false papers can change what I know to be true about the man I married. The king looked at her with interest. Continue, Lady Charlotte. Charlotte felt every eye in the room focused on her, but she pushed aside her fear and spoke from her heart. The man who stands beside me is kind to servants and gentle with children. He works late into the night studying laws and policies to help his people. He could have married any princess in Europe, but he chose me because we loved each other. These are not the actions of someone pretending to be royal. These are the actions of someone born to serve others. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces looked skeptical, but others seemed to be considering her words. Lord Blackwood stepped forward again. Pretty words, Lady Charlotte, but words are not evidence. We have documents, we have witnesses. What do you have besides your feelings? Before Charlotte could answer, a commotion arose near the entrance to the throne room. The large doors opened, and a small group of people entered. Charlotte squinted to see who they were, and her heart leaped when she recognized one of the figures. It was Dr. Harrison, the physician who had delivered all 3 of her children. He was an old man now, with white hair and a walking stick, but his eyes were still bright and alert. Behind him walked Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper who had worked at Thornfield Castle since before Alexander was born, Your Majesty. Dr. Harrison said, his voice carrying clearly despite his age. I apologize for the interruption, but I have traveled far to speak on behalf of Prince Alexander and Lady Charlotte. The king gestured for him to approach. Dr. Harrison walked slowly but steadily across the great room, with Mrs. Peterson close behind him. I have been the family physician for 35 years, Dr. Harrison said when he reached the throne. I delivered Prince Alexander myself, in the royal birthing chamber, exactly as the official records state. I have his birth certificate in my own handwriting, witnessed by 3 other physicians and the midwife who assisted me. Lord Blackwood's face darkened. That proves nothing. Documents can be forged by anyone. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward. She was a small woman, but her voice was firm and clear. My lord, she said, I have worked in the royal household since I was 15 years old. I remember the night Prince Alexander was born. I remember his first steps, his first words, his first day of lessons. I watched him grow from a baby into the man he is today. No actor could fool someone who raised him. The king leaned forward in his throne. And the children, he asked. What can you tell us about Prince Alexander's children? Dr. Harrison smiled for the first time since entering the room. I delivered all 3 of them, Your Majesty. Emma, Thomas, and James. Each one has the distinctive birthmark that runs in the royal family. Each one has their father's eyes and their mother's stubborn spirit. Charlotte felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest. These people had come so far to defend them. They were risking their own safety by contradicting the powerful nobles who were spreading the lies. But Lord Blackwood was not finished. He pulled out another document. And what of this marriage certificate? He said, showing it to the room. This document suggests that Lady Charlotte was already married to someone else when she wed Prince Alexander. Charlotte gasped in shock. This was a new lie, one she had not heard before. She looked at Alexander and saw her own confusion reflected in his eyes. The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Charlotte realized that their fight for the truth was far from over. Charlotte stared at the document in Lord Blackwood's hands, feeling like the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. The paper looked old and official, with fancy writing and what appeared to be genuine seals. But she knew it was impossible, because she had never been married to anyone before Alexander. That is completely false, she said, her voice shaking with anger rather than fear. I have never been married to anyone else. I met Alexander when I was 20 years old, and he was the first and only man I ever loved. Lord Blackwood held up the document for everyone to see. This marriage certificate shows that Lady Charlotte married a blacksmith named Thomas Wheeler when she was 18 years old. The marriage took place in the village of Millbrook, witnessed by the local priest and recorded in the church records. Charlotte felt dizzy. Millbrook was a real place near her childhood home. Thomas Wheeler had been a real person, a kind young man who had asked to court her when she was 17, but she had refused his proposal because she did not love him, and he had eventually married someone else. Alexander stepped protectively in front of his wife. This is another lie, he said firmly. Charlotte told me about Thomas Wheeler years ago. She refused his proposal, and he married the baker's daughter. We attended their wedding celebration. But Lord Blackwood was prepared for this response. He produced another paper from his seemingly endless collection of false documents. Here is the death certificate for Thomas Wheeler's wife, he said. She died in childbirth just 6 months after their wedding. This left Thomas free to marry Lady Charlotte in secret. The lies were so carefully woven together that Charlotte could see some people in the room beginning to look convinced. She realized that whoever was behind this conspiracy had spent months or even years preparing these false documents. Your Majesty, Charlotte said, turning to address the king directly, I swear on the lives of my children that I have never been married to anyone but your nephew. I can bring witnesses from my home village who will testify that I refused Thomas Wheeler's proposal and never saw him again after his wedding to Mary Baker. The king looked thoughtful. And where is this Thomas Wheeler now? He asked Lord Blackwood. If he was Lady Charlotte's first husband, surely he would be here to claim her. Lord Blackwood's expression flickered for just a moment, and Charlotte caught the brief look of uncertainty that crossed his face. Unfortunately, Your Majesty, Thomas Wheeler died in a farming accident 2 years ago, but before his death he told several people about his secret marriage to Lady Charlotte. Of course he did. Alexander said sarcastically, how convenient that. All your witnesses are either dead or too frightened to speak for themselves. At that moment, another interruption occurred. The throne room doors opened again, and Charlotte's heart nearly stopped when she saw who entered. It was her father, Dr. William Morrison, followed by an elderly priest she recognized as Father Benedict from her home village. Her father looked older and more tired than when she had last seen him, but his eyes were bright with determination. He had clearly traveled through the night to reach the capital city, Your Majesty, Dr. Morrison said, bowing respectfully before the throne. I am Dr. William Morrison, father of Lady Charlotte. I have come to speak the truth about my daughter's marriage. Charlotte felt tears starting to flow down her cheeks. But these were tears of relief and gratitude. Her father had come to defend her, just as he had protected her throughout her childhood. The king gestured for Dr. Morrison to approach. Speak, doctor. What truth do you bring us? Dr. Morrison walked forward with dignity, despite his simple clothes and travel-stained appearance. Your Majesty, my daughter has never been married to Thomas Wheeler or any other man before Prince Alexander. I was present at every important moment of her life until she married your nephew. I would have known if she had married someone else. Lord Blackwood interrupted quickly. But Dr. Morrison, could Charlotte have married in secret without your knowledge? Charlotte's father looked at Lord Blackwood with the kind of steady gaze he had once used to face down angry patients in difficult situations. My lord, he said calmly, my daughter lived in my house until she was 21 years old. She helped me with my medical practice every day. She was never away from home long enough to travel to another village, get married, and return without my knowledge. Father Benedict stepped forward. His voice was weak with age, but his words were clear. Your Majesty, I have been the priest in Millbrook for 43 years. I have performed every wedding in that village during that time. I never married Lady Charlotte to Thomas Wheeler or to anyone else. The church records will show this clearly. Charlotte watched Lord Blackwood's face grow red with frustration. His carefully constructed lies were falling apart in front of everyone. These church records could have been altered. Lord Blackwood said desperately, old priests make mistakes in their record-keeping. Father Benedict straightened his bent shoulders. Young man, he said with dignity, I may be old, but my memory is perfect when it comes to the sacraments I have performed. I remember every wedding, every baptism, every funeral. Lady Charlotte was never married in my church. The king looked around the room at all the people who had spoken. Charlotte could see that he was weighing everything he had heard, trying to decide what was true and what was false. Dr. Harrison stepped forward again. Your Majesty, if I may suggest something, these accusations require proof beyond documents that can be forged and witnesses who are conveniently dead. Perhaps we should look for evidence that cannot be faked. What kind of evidence? The king asked. Charlotte held her breath as Dr. Harrison explained his idea. The royal family has kept detailed medical records for generations. Prince Alexander's birth records include not just the basic information, but also detailed notes about his health, his physical characteristics, and even a drawing of the birthmark on his shoulder. These records were made by multiple doctors and stored in the Royal Medical Archives. Similarly, Charlotte's marriage to Prince Alexander was witnessed by dozens of people, including foreign diplomats who sent reports back to their own countries. The wedding gifts they received are still displayed at Thornfield Castle, each one carefully catalogued with the name of the giver. Lord Blackwood tried to object. Medical records can be falsified just like any other documents, but Dr. Harrison shook his head. Not these records, my lord. They were written in a special ink that changes color over time. Any additions or changes made later would be obvious. Also, the foreign diplomatic reports about the wedding are stored in other countries. Lord Blackwood would have had to convince multiple foreign governments to participate in his conspiracy. Charlotte saw hope beginning to return to Alexander's eyes. She also noticed that some of the nobles who had seemed convinced by Lord Blackwood's lies were now looking uncertain. The king raised his hand for silence. It is clear that we need to examine all this evidence carefully. Lord Hampton, I want you to gather a committee of trusted advisors to investigate these claims thoroughly. Check the medical records, contact the foreign diplomats, examine the church records from Millbrook. Lord Blackwood looked panicked. Your Majesty, surely these investigations are unnecessary. The evidence I have presented speaks for itself. The evidence you have presented raises more questions than it answers. The king replied firmly. Until we have verified the truth, I am suspending all proceedings against Prince Alexander and Lady Charlotte. Charlotte felt like she could breathe again for the first time in days. They were not cleared of all accusations yet, but at least they had been given time to prove their innocence properly. As the crowd began to disperse, Charlotte noticed something that made her blood run cold. Lord Blackwood was whispering urgently to Lady Victoria, and both of them kept glancing toward a side door of the throne room. Charlotte had the terrible feeling that their enemies were not giving up, but rather planning something even more dangerous. That evening, Charlotte could not shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. She paced back and forth in her palace room, stopping every few minutes to look out the window at the dark courtyard below. Alexander had gone to meet with Lord Hampton and other trusted advisors to plan their defense, leaving Charlotte alone with her worried thoughts. A soft knock interrupted her anxious walking. She opened the door to find her father standing in the hallway looking concerned. "My dear daughter," Dr. Morrison said, stepping into the room. "You look like you have not slept in days." Charlotte hugged him tightly, grateful for his familiar warmth and strength. "Oh, Papa," she said, using the childhood name she had not spoken in years. "I am so frightened, not just for Alexander and me, but for our children. What if our enemies try to hurt them?" Dr. Morrison held his daughter close and spoke, in the gentle voice he had used to comfort her throughout her childhood. "Your children are safe at Thornfield Castle with your sister Margaret. I sent word to her before I came here, and she has moved the children to the old tower room where they will be better protected." Charlotte felt some of her anxiety ease. "But not all of it, Papa," she said, stepping back to look at her father's face, "who could hate us so much that they would create all these lies. We have lived quietly for years. We have never hurt anyone." Dr. Morrison's expression grew serious. "I have been thinking about that question since I arrived here. During my journey to the capital, I heard many rumors and stories. Some people believe the lies about you and Alexander, but others are asking different questions." "What kind of questions?" Charlotte asked. Her father walked to the window and looked out at the night sky. "They are asking who benefits if Alexander loses his claim to the throne. They are asking who has the money and power to create such elaborate false documents. They are asking who would be next in line if both Prince David and Alexander were removed from succession." Charlotte felt her stomach tighten with fear. "You think this is all about Richard becoming king?" Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. "Richard has always believed he deserved the throne more than anyone else. But he is not the only one involved in this conspiracy. Someone else is helping him. Someone with connections throughout the kingdom." Before Charlotte could ask who he meant, another knock came at her door. This time it was Alexander, but he was not alone. Behind him stood a young woman Charlotte did not recognize, dressed in the simple clothes of a servant. "Charlotte," Alexander said urgently, "this is Mary, one of the kitchen maids here at the palace. She has something very important to tell us." The young woman looked nervous and kept glancing toward the door as if she expected someone to burst in at any moment. She curtsied awkwardly to Charlotte and Dr. Morrison. "Your ladyship," Mary said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I heard something tonight that I think you should know. I was cleaning the fireplace in Lord Blackwood's private study when he came in with Lady Victoria. They did not see me because I was hidden behind a large chair." "What did you hear?" Charlotte asked gently, trying to put the frightened girl at ease. Mary took a deep breath before continuing. "They were talking about tomorrow. Lord Blackwood said that the evidence investigation would prove that you and Prince Alexander are innocent. Lady Victoria was very angry about this. She said they needed to take action before the truth came out." Alexander moved closer. "What kind of action?" Mary's voice became even quieter. "Lady Victoria said they should arrange an accident. She said that if both you and Prince Alexander were killed, everyone would assume it was because you were guilty in trying to escape justice. Then Richard would become the heir, and no one would question his right to the throne." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. "An accident," she repeated. "They want to kill us." Dr. Morrison stepped forward. "Did they say when or how they planned to do this?" Mary nodded quickly. "Tomorrow morning, during the evidence examination, they plan to create a fire in the records room. While you are inside, looking at the documents, they will block the door so you cannot escape, and then claim it was an accident caused by old papers and candles." Alexander ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Charlotte recognized as his way of thinking through a difficult problem. "We have to stop them," he said. "But we need proof of their plan." Mary reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "I found this on the floor after they left." It fell out of Lady Victoria's purse. Charlotte took the paper and read it quickly. It was a note written in Lady Victoria's handwriting, giving detailed instructions about placing oil-soaked rags in the records room and ensuring that all windows would be sealed shut. "This is evidence of their plot," Dr. Morrison said, examining the note, "but we need to be very careful about how we use it. If we accuse them directly, they might simply change their plan or deny everything. Alexander began pacing the room, just as Charlotte had been doing earlier. We need to set a trap, he said. We need to catch them in the act of trying to kill us. That sounds very dangerous, Charlotte said. What if something goes wrong? Alexander stopped pacing and took her hands in his. Charlotte, we cannot keep running from these lies and threats. If we do not stop Richard and his supporters now, they will keep trying to destroy us. Our children will never be safe. Charlotte knew he was right, but the thought of deliberately walking into danger made her feel sick with worry. What do you propose we do? She asked. Alexander looked at Mary, who was still standing nervously by the door. Mary, can you get back to Lord Blackwood's study without anyone seeing you? The young woman nodded. Yes, Your Highness. I know all the secret passages the servants use. Alexander's eyes lit up with an idea. Here is what we will do. Mary, you will go back and leave a different note where Lady Victoria dropped this one. The new note will suggest that their plan has been moved to a different location. Dr. Morrison looked interested. What location? The old chapel in the East Wing, Alexander said. It has been abandoned for years, but it has only one entrance and the windows are too high to climb through. If we can lure them there instead of the records room, we can trap them and have witnesses to their confession. Charlotte was beginning to understand the plan. We will pretend to discover evidence in the chapel that proves our innocence. When they come to stop us, Lord Hampton and the other advisors will be waiting nearby to witness everything. Exactly, Alexander said. But Charlotte, you do not have to be part of this. It would be safer if you stayed here while I handled the confrontation. Charlotte shook her head firmly. No, Alexander, we have faced everything else together, and we will face this together too. Besides, they want to kill both of us. If I am not there, they might become suspicious. Dr. Morrison looked proud of his daughter's courage. I will be nearby as well, he said. If anyone gets hurt, you will need a doctor immediately. That Mary spoke up again. Your Highness, there is something else you should know. I heard Lady Victoria mention that they have supporters among the palace guards. Some of the men who are supposed to protect you are actually working for Richard. This news made their situation even more dangerous, but Alexander nodded as if he had expected it. Then we will have to be very careful about which guards we trust. Lord Hampton will know which men are truly loyal to the king. They spent the rest of the night planning every detail of their trap. Charlotte tried to sleep for a few hours, but her mind kept racing with all the things that could go wrong. When morning came, she dressed carefully in her most practical clothes and said a silent prayer for the safety of everyone involved in their dangerous plan. As she and Alexander walked toward the abandoned chapel, Charlotte thought about her children safe at home with Margaret. Whatever happened today, she was determined that Emma, Thomas, and James would grow up knowing that their parents had fought bravely for the truth. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the palace walls, and Charlotte could not help but wonder if this would be the last sunrise she would ever see.